Southeast Asia, or should we say China's strategic backyard, is known to be heavily impacted by Xi Jinping's assertive foreign policy. As Beijing's power has grown over the last decade, so has Washington's unease. And now, after years of seesawing, the US is trying to engage with the region again. But the question is it too late for Biden to reshape alliances in Xi Jinping's backyard? The leaders of the two superpowers were under the same roof today. They met in Indonesia on the sidelines of the G20 summit. This came after Biden attended the annual ASEAN summit in Cambodia. Now, at the summit, Biden pledged to work closely with the Southeast Asian nations. He also reportedly announced over $250 million in aid, making it clear that the US wants to play in China's backyard. However, America seems to have overlooked one crucial thing: the diplomatic environment is much more treacherous now. The Southeast Asian bloc was once considered pivotal for diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific, but lately it has been struggling to remain effective in an increasingly polarized world. ASEAN has mellowed down. It has fashioned itself as a zone of peace and neutrality. Its 10 member states walk on eggshells around their powerful neighbor, China. They seek consensus and refrain from criticizing each other, and this reflects through its small and weak secretariat, which lacks strategies and tactics to enforce decisions on the members. What makes us say so? Well, it is China's charm offensive in Southeast Asia under Xi Jinping's rule. ASEAN used to hold its ground when there was a broad global consensus led by the US. But China's arrival on the global market and its growing influence coincided with America's diminishing interest in the Southeast Asian region in early 2000s. And then what happened in the last decade? Well, China has occupied and developed military presence on the Reef Islands of the South China Sea. This has brought the superpower into direct conflict with other claimants, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines. And ASEAN's efforts to tame China in the disputed areas have been futile so far. Beijing has simply stalled negotiations for 20 long years. It has also dismissed an international court ruling in 2016 that nullified its claims. In the face of America's renewed interest, members of ASEAN find themselves in a sticky position. First, China is so important economically and powerful militarily that only a few dare to confront it openly. Second, China has effectively destroyed ASEAN unity by picking off smaller states such as Laos and Cambodia. They are now so dependent on Beijing's charity that some claim they are more or less client states. This was clear even in 2012 when Cambodia last took the rotating ASEAN chair and blocked a final statement critical of Beijing's position in the South China Sea. But this wariness of China doesn't spell good news for the US Southeast Asian countries. Southeast Asian countries seem to have become disenchanted with Washington. They see it as an unreliable partner which is too preoccupied with human rights and democracy. The US forced the region to accept hugely unpopular and tough economic measures after the 1997 Asian financial crash. It also disengaged from the bloc almost completely during President George Bush's war on terror. And most importantly, US dramatically changed its stance towards the Southeast region as Trump took the reins of the country. For all its overtures, no US administration has been willing to pursue free trade agreements. This seems to have soured the deal for Southeast Asia, which is perhaps the most trade-dependent region in the world. However, US can still draw comfort knowing that ASEAN will engage with other powers to counterweigh China. China is also unlikely to have close military allies in the region, in the way US has in Japan and Australia. But all ASEAN countries, to varying degrees, now seem to accept China as a dominant power in the region, a power which is unwilling to make concessions where its own interests are at stake. And America seems to have lagged behind in the race. And for more, John Edith joins us live from Washington. John is the Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms and Control and Non-Proliferation. John, very happy to have you on WION World is One.
It's good to be here.
John, let's begin with the most obvious question. And I have to ask you this. Is US too late to the party? Is it too late to reshape its alliances in Xi Jinping's backyard, given China's growing power in the region?
I spent 30 years as a US diplomat, so I think it's never too late for dialogue and diplomacy. There's an opportunity, and it's based on common interests that the US has with many of the countries of the region, and a common interest in managing a increasingly aggressive Chinese foreign policy. So I don't think it's too late. I think it's always a good time for dialogue.
John, if you talk about the nations in that region that we're talking about at the moment, now some nations around the South China Sea, like Vietnam and the Philippines, are in a conflict with China over the Reef Islands. That's no secret. Now, the United States is increasingly offering its military and diplomatic cooperation with Asian nations. The question is, do you feel these nations would also be willing to collaborate with the US?
That, of course, is a question for those governments. As I said, there are common interests in maintaining free trade and freedom of navigation in the sea lanes in that region. So there is the basis for cooperation and the basis for agreement. It is important, however, not to treat the competition with China as a purely military one. The military aspect is in many ways the least important. It's much more important to look at this in terms of promoting free trade, free markets, and democratic values. And that's where the US has a great deal in common with many of the states of the region.
John, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific region specifically, India's role cannot be denied. How far do you feel India will play a role in tackling China, at least for the US?
I think India is a very important partner, not just for the US, but for all of the countries of the region because of the shared values and the shared belief in democratic systems. What we see in terms of the competition with China is a competition of ideas. On the one hand, US, India, many of the other states believe in democracy and in individual rights. China is instead promoting a model based on state control. And that's a fundamental difference in a fundamental area of competition that we cannot ignore.
Thank you so much for joining in, John. That's all for now, but I'm sure there'll be a lot more to discuss in the times to come.
Thank you.